So hello and welcome to a Brainaura webinar. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about preparing an international PhD application and how to use this time productively during the Covid-19 lockdown to take your career forward. I am Promit and I work for Brainaura as a team lead for the Destination PhD program. And I also work full-time in Berlin as a business intelligence consultant for a digital healthcare firm. This webinar is being presented as a part of the Destination PhD program, which is a Brainaura offering to help guide students through the PhD application process. So the Destination PhD program basically walks students through the entire process of applying for a PhD, from the basic aspects of finding the right university, the right professor, to taking them through the complete information about entry requirements, assisting them with modifying their application documents, their CVs, their statements of purpose, and then helping them select a topic and writing a project proposal. The Destination PhD program also helps people with funding possibilities to help them fund their PhDs, to apply for studentships, to apply for scholarships. And finally, an important part of the application process is coming up with suitable publications. The Destination PhD program also helps students with suitable publications that would help them in the PhD application process. So the contents of my webinar here at a glance are basically first to explain why international PhDs are popular. So explaining the advantages and what makes people apply for PhDs abroad. And when I say abroad, I'm talking about the Indian perspective. So apply abroad from India, but this would hold true for people applying abroad from anywhere in general. I will then present a typical PhD application checklist, which would enlist all aspects that an applicant would have to keep in mind before submitting a PhD application. I will then talk about the emotional aspect of doing a PhD, getting into the right mindset, choosing an appropriate PhD topic, and then talk about some of the most common reasons for PhDs not working out, and then moving on from there on to how a statement of purpose has to be structured, and finally, a few comments on finding the right position. I want to emphasize here that this is not a detailed explanation on every aspect, because we will be doing this in upcoming webinars. This is a bird's eye view of the entire application process, and each of these points will later be elaborated in our upcoming blogs and webinars. So firstly, why are international PhDs popular? The most common reason for people to pursue international PhDs is the opportunity that is at their fingertips. Applying for PhDs abroad gives people access to the top research groups and facilities around the world. This could mean instrumentation, this could mean research facilities, collaborations. Particularly for people in niche fields, it's difficult to find prospective supervisors in the same research field. Applying abroad helps you break out of this bubble. The other very common reason is for PhDs abroad to be more structured and less open-ended. So often PhDs come with fixed timelines, fixed deadlines, fixed targets, and therefore there's less room for negotiation, and so applicants feel safer applying for these programs. Funding possibilities are usually much more varied abroad, because there are studentships, there are scholarships, there are university teaching positions, and then there are a lot of countries, particularly in the European Union, where tuition is free, and therefore the coursework that master students go through is also accessible to PhD students for no cost. PhD students pursuing their doctorates abroad also get access to a diverse network. This could be professional and personal, because they have collaborations both in academia and industry, and this often helps them through their life even once their PhD is done. From a personal aspect, PhD students often get cultural exposure, work-life balance, and an opportunity to interact socially with people who they wouldn't be meeting in their own countries. And this often makes the PhD process very fulfilling. And of course, future prospects are better defined and more lucrative for people applying for international PhDs, because they know exactly how the international PhD is going to help them with their future goals. Here we present to you a PhD application checklist, just some factors that one would have to account for before going through the marathon of applying for a PhD. So the first aspect is to know what a PhD is and what a PhD is not. And then one has to find their purpose and express this in a good statement of purpose, which is probably the most important application document in the PhD process. Another aspect then to talk about is evaluating one's credentials and where he or she stands in terms of the competition. And then one would need to align their personal and professional interests to prospective research groups of interest. An important aspect is to fund your PhD or finance your PhD, because PhDs last for 3 years to 5 years, and it is very important to be realistic about funding requirements during this period. For people requiring a visa to study abroad, scholarship applications and visa requirements usually go hand in hand. And a last but very important aspect is to fit into the work culture of the given country. When I talk about work culture, I also mean fitting into the research group, fitting into the city, fitting into the lifestyle. And this could mean various things like learning languages, learning about the culture, learning to cook, whatever it might mean for you. One thing that I've personally come across is students actually learning foreign languages before going and taking up PhDs, because this makes the transition period shorter and makes the transition a lot smoother. They can focus on their PhD and not on settling into the culture of the country once they're there. So getting into the right mindset for a PhD is extremely important. And in this regard, it's important to know that a PhD is not an extended master degree. It might feel like the logical next step after your master's thesis, but it is really not. It's much longer, much more involved, and you are typically left on your own. And this is not the case in a master's thesis. The doctor title often means little outside academia, and it's important for prospective applicants to internalize this. It is also often thought that PhDs are hired in industry with huge paychecks. This is not automatic at all and usually varies based on a lot of factors, such as the student's personal skills, professional skills, and their network. A PhD is a scope for extended learning, but definitely not the only way to get better at what you do. An important social aspect to consider is to see people you studied with, colleagues of yours placed at companies before you are, and often with positions better than yours, or at least better paid than yours. And PhDs definitely do not make people experts immediately. It's very important to understand and accept this, because usually a PhD only makes you aware that there is a lot left for you still to learn. Well, now that we've got that out of the way, how do you know that a PhD is right for you? What are the factors to be considered? Well, the first thing is to know the scope and perspective of your PhD. That is, why are you doing a PhD? Where is it going to take you? And how it is going to fit into your professional goals? This would be unique to every candidate, but it is important to be honest to oneself and have a rock-solid reason to do a PhD. This would make the difficulties during the PhD process much more bearable. Then one also has to be honest about the pros and cons of doing a PhD. The most important pro would be what it means for you in terms of your professional life that's going to come after your PhD. Typical cons would be the student life, financial difficulties, psychological difficulties, and the pressure of deadlines. There are a lot of responsibilities that a PhD student has, which is not to be underestimated. Life as a PhD student is a typical student life with pressure, deadlines, financial crisis, and an often uncertain future. So one also should be very honest and upfront about the path and prospects after a PhD. Finally, an important point for consideration is an advantage that a PhD would give you over other candidates in the job market, other job applicants. What skills would your PhD give you that you wouldn't get through a master's or through work experience? This is a question that one has to ask themselves before entering the PhD process. The next aspect then is to plan the course of the PhD during the application process itself. One way to do this is to make sure that you and your potential supervisor are on the same page with respect to goals, timelines, where you're expecting to go with the research. This is particularly important for scholarship and funding applications because in a way, people expect you to know where your research is going even before you have begun your research. And this is also very important with regard to the two different types of PhDs, structured and individual PhDs, because this would help you figure out which is right for you. A structured PhD is usually part of a graduate school where you're taken through a guided process, and an individual PhD requires you to apply to a specific project which has funding. Depending on how specific and how niche your research interest is, one can choose from one of these two typical PhD patterns. The final point in planning the course of the PhD is to figure out how your personal prospects and goals align with your decision to do a PhD. The logical next step then is to think about a PhD topic that can be chosen, which can stay with you for 4 to 5 years. Of course, a poorly chosen topic is a recipe for disaster. And therefore, going with any topic that just comes with scholarship or that sounds fancy is an absolute no-no. It's very important to do some research, understand the advancement within a field, and evaluate honestly if you can actually add to this research within the stipulated time frame. It's important to realize that this is a 4-5 year commitment, not a lifetime commitment. It has to be feasible. It has to demonstrate enough of your skills and abilities that you can later leverage this for employment. You will eventually need employment, and this is very important to remember. Whether it's in industry or in academia, you have to have something to show for the 4 to 5 years that you have put into the PhD. Why do PhDs often not work out? Well, the most common reason is loss of motivation in the process. So students who have just joined often come with unrealistic optimism, expecting every experiment to work out, and then there is a severe loss of enthusiasm, which then leads to them quitting. What also often happens is that students do not get the supervisor of choice. So they hope to get into a research group when they join, integrated PhD programs, which involve a master and a PhD, and then they don't get the supervisor of choice, and then they drop out. Unfortunately, what is often also seen is that people don't take the PhD proposal and the literature carefully enough. So they get into the process with unrealistic goals. So they don't know if the PhD is the right choice for them or not. And if these doubts appear early in your mind during a PhD, I can tell you that they will only get progressively worse over time and ultimately lead to you quitting. Of course, closely tied with these aspects is the psychological aspect, the mental health aspect, and of course, stress and workload is really, really, really difficult to handle, and probably even more so for a PhD student, which leads to them dropping out. Moving on to the general formal educational requirements for PhD, usually one would need a master's degree with good grades. But what often happens, particularly in the US, that a PhD comes with a master's, and therefore people with bachelors can apply for these integrated PhD positions, where 2 to 3 years into the PhD, you get a master's degree, and then you work on your PhD. One point to keep in mind is that these bachelors are usually 4 years long, whereas the Indian bachelors and European bachelors are typically 3 years or even shorter. And therefore, what happens is you would either need a master's degree to apply for these positions or internship experience that could count as a 4-year bachelor. What also generally helps in applications is the presence of good publications and demonstration of specific research interests targeted to the prospective research group. For applications to the US in particular, international test scores such as GRE and TOEFL, along with specific academic interests, can really help you stand out and make your way smoothly through the PhD process. In general, anything else that adds to the CV and sets you apart from the competition, diploma, certificate courses, internship experience, all of this can only help you in terms of educational requirements for the PhD. Moving on next to the application requirements, one would first need to either identify a potential supervisor or identify a graduate school, one of the two. And sometimes people also identify graduate schools for PhDs in Europe. This is a trend that has actually now come into existence. The earlier pattern was to reach out to professors and then get into the PhD program. But now the grad school pattern has come into Europe as well, gradually. One would also need to shortlist universities based on career goals. Then, like I said, the most important aspect of applying for a PhD is to identify your purpose and then express this in your statement of purpose. And then once you want to approach a prospective supervisor, you would need a letter of recommendation from your present supervisor. So we actually intend to have a detailed webinar about how one should approach the supervisor for a letter of recommendation, who to ask, first of all, and then what should the letter of recommendation demonstrate to your prospective supervisor. Let's quickly talk about the statement of purpose. So a statement of purpose is a personal statement which is basically information on a PhD applicant's background relevant to the program that they are applying from. So this is different from a research proposal because a research proposal outlines a particular research topic, explaining its aims, its methodology, and its scientific value, whereas a personal statement talks about the candidate. SOPs can take different forms, but in all forms, you are requested to talk about how your specific goals align with the PhD. The statement of purpose is usually read by admission tutors, potential supervisors, panelists, and sometimes organizations that are likely to fund your PhD. The purpose of your SOP is to convince everybody that you are the right person for this PhD position. And how do you do that? For that, let's talk about the touch points of the SOP. So the first aspect is to tell them where you're coming from. What's your background? What made you choose this path? Be relevant, be brief. This is not a life story. Often experiences inspire us to pursue a PhD. In that case, the focus should be on how this experience is aligned to the PhD and not the experience itself. Motivation to pursue a PhD is often one of the most attractive aspects of a statement of purpose. So one has to be sure about why they want to pursue this path and how they plan to build on it. If applying for an advertised project, then the focus has to be on why this project is worth pursuing. A statement of purpose is not and should not be a repetition of your CV. However, it can be a chance to build upon aspects of your CV that you think need explaining, such as gap years or specific aspects that you want to draw attention to. This is a wonderful opportunity to do that and stand out from the crowd. It's also important to show people that there exists a life outside work, and a nice way to do that is to show your extracurricular experiences, but again with relevance to the PhD, showing them facts about yourself that show self-motivation, project management, the desire to work independently. These could be wonderful contents of a statement of purpose. And then there is this general aspect of your broader goals and motivations and how the PhD fits into this. Like I said earlier, this is a great opportunity to expand upon your CV and to draw attention to specific aspects of your CV. Then we talk about how an SOP is to be written. So usually you need to select, sequence, and organize your material. SOP should be about 400, 500 words, should fit in one side of a sheet of A4 paper. You need to be as concise and communicative as possible. And the sequence is usually introducing yourself, progressing into your research interests, and then focusing on your skills and how your long-term goals fit into this decision to do a PhD. The writing style has to be easy to read, yet professional, passionate, and enthusiastic. It is an advertisement document and should be treated as one. You are here not to beg and plead, but to show that you are the perfect person for this position. The next aspect then is to consider funding. This, of course, is a very broad topic and will be the content of another webinar because this varies from specific PhD positions to specific countries to specific programs. However, in general, one would need to write a scholarship or a research grant to fund your PhD or take up employment for the university as a teaching assistant or as a research assistant. So one should be aware of what improves your chances of getting funded if you're applying to a graduate school and what is expected of you if your PhD is funded through an employment contract. If you're hired as a research assistant, you're usually expected to be involved in research activities outside of your PhD. If you're hired as a teaching assistant, you're required to teach bachelor's, master's students, and even help with grading their assignments. So it's important to have these aspects clarified before starting this PhD process. The final aspect that I wish to touch upon in this webinar is to talk about how you find the right position. This too is country specific, but there are websites which have been highlighted here where One can find advertised PhD positions, such as Find a PhD, scholarship positions, the nanoscience community, PhD portal, and so on. Another commonly employed method is to contact potential supervisors, particularly if they are authors of papers that you have read. Because many positions are not advertised, if not funded by big organizations, but a nice way to demonstrate genuine interest is to reach out to people and tell them that you have read a paper written by them. My personal story is similar as well. I contacted my PhD supervisor after reading a paper by her and telling her that I actually worked on something similar to that paper and how I was inspired by that paper. This often works really well. A third aspect to consider is that a lot of industries need PhDs and need collaborations with PhDs, and therefore they hire PhDs and place them in universities and probably even hire them afterwards. So looking out for industries that collaborate with academia is another way to find the right position. Then we move on to the social media and website for Brainaura. You can visit the website of Brainaura at www.brainaura.com or write to us at info@brainaura.com, and we have our social media channels illustrated here. That's all for this webinar. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to interacting with you in later webinars, and please do check out our blogs in this series. Thank you.